So you're all very, very welcome, guys. What I would like to do is put the entire retreat for the next 3 days with God's help under the protection of Christ consciousness. So there's a beautiful old ancient Irish hymn that I sing it every Sunday before I read the gospel at Mass, because it puts me in an altered state of consciousness. And since the topic of our retreat is Christ consciousness, I want to sing it in Gaelic for you. And basically it says, Lord Jesus, cleanse my heart, make my thoughts clear, and the words of my mouth. O Iesu, glan machrisha, goch lechlan, goch lon. Isa Iesu, Heer minzing, veel macht dachran. Dan muss muinta go firchlan, agus brera movail. Isa hirma ayeilish, stjorichia movail. So we'll have 7 lectures over the course of the next 3 days with God's help, all on the theme of Christ consciousness. So for the first lecture tonight, I want to focus on Christ consciousness and the cohort. I think you all got handouts. Did you all get handouts? So you'll be able to see the kind of the progress. So I've been recording my dreams since 1979. And at some stage, I began seeding my dreams. It's a Jungian technique where before you go to sleep at night, you drop a thought into your consciousness and say, I'd like some input. I would like my dreams to address a particular kind of issue. And then presume that the dreams of the night will be kind of symbolic representations of the question that you formulated for yourself. And so I've been seeding my dreams for maybe 30 years at this stage. And I've gotten a lot of one-liners and quotes. And I would say that the vast bulk of the homilies that I do on Sundays are the result of stuff that comes to me in dreams. And for me, dreams and visions are the same thing. In the Hebrew scriptures, they're synonyms. A dream is a vision you're having when you're asleep. And a vision is a dream you're having when you're awake. And so basically, in the spiritual mystical literature, dreams and visions are the same thing. They just come in different states of consciousness. And so for me, my dream life and my vision life are the source of any books I've written and all of the homilies and lectures I've given. So about 3 years ago, I wanted a pithy definition of Christ consciousness. And so before I went to sleep at night, I dropped that intention. Give me a pithy articulation of what Christ consciousness means. And I woke up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and in my mind I heard, Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings. And so we can go home now, that's the whole thing. So Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings. And so, God willing, we'll spend the next 3 days together just teasing that apart. What does that mean in practicality? The word Christ, or the phrase Christ consciousness, is kind of a phrase, obviously, that Christians are going to use for that particular kind of state of consciousness. Other synonyms for it would be things like enlightenment. Some religious traditions will call that enlightenment. Some will call it discovering your Buddha nature. Some will call it self-realization. The Tao Te Ching will call it the Tao, or the way. So there are many, many great spiritual traditions who've come across this concept and will give it different names. But basically, when you dig into it, they're all approaching the same thing. Now, the concept then of Christ consciousness, as we tend to use it, refers to a kind of a state of spiritual awareness that embodies divine qualities and like compassion and enlightenment and union with God. And it's about managing to access an enlightened state where you have a more kind of universal perspective on life. So we had a great discussion at lunch, Dina and Chris and myself, and Pat and Dale were at the table. We had a great discussion about this notion of deeper states of consciousness, and that we need to learn how to surf, where we live in a very dense three-dimensional level of consciousness, but there are many, many levels above that. There's our astral bodies, which are vibrating at a higher frequency. There is the astral body, which is vibrating still higher, and it's the place where we access when we're dreaming. And when you're dreaming, you've out-distanced space and time. So the scientific model is based on 4 kinds of areas: space, time, energy, and matter. But when you're dreaming at night, there is neither space nor time. I've had the dreams where I've been 6,000 miles to the east, speaking with my grandfather who died 70 years ago. So I've gone 6,000 miles to the east and 70 years back in time, and I'm talking to my grandfather. So there had been no space or time. And in fact, when you learn how to dream lucidly, one of the tests of lucid dreaming, if you become aware in a dream, I think I'm dreaming, and I know that I'm dreaming, how do I test this? A simple test is to put your hand against a solid object in your dream and push. If your hand goes through it, you're dreaming. If your hand doesn't go through it, you're not dreaming. And so what happens? Matter disappears. So when you're in the dream state, there's neither space, time, nor matter. All you're left with is some form of energy. And so Christ consciousness then is about learning to surf the various dimensions until you manage to kind of surpass space, time, and matter, and you're dealing with a totally different kind of energy, the energy then that we would call Christ consciousness. Now, the Hindus had a great notion for this. The Hindu rishis, 10,000s of years ago, came up with this beautiful phrase called Namaste. And Namaste literally means the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And so if you tease this apart, what is it actually saying? It is literally, it is God greeting God. So there's this beautiful story in Luke's Gospel in chapter 2, where Mary, who is newly pregnant, is going to visit her cousin Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is way beyond menopause, but she's conceived a child and she's 6 months pregnant. And when the two women meet, there's this extraordinary exchange between them. And for me, it's like, I call it the Christian Namaste. They greet each other because they both recognize the divine in the other. Elizabeth says, "Who am I that the mother of my God should visit me?" So she's aware of what Mary is carrying in her womb, the Christ child. But Mary is aware of John the Baptist, whom Elizabeth is carrying in her womb. So it is that Mary's inner divinity recognizes the inner divinity of Elizabeth. And it's not just the children they're carrying, but that each of them themselves, is a divine being. So Mary is recognizing the divinity of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is recognizing the divinity of Mary, and the two babies in utero are recognizing the divinity in each other. So I call that the Christian Namaste. So Namaste for me is a really powerful prayer then. So as I say, it basically is God greeting God. It is God in disguise acknowledging and recognizing God in disguise. So everybody here. And it's not just the people, it is everything that exists on the planet. There is nothing which is not God. Everything that exists is in a kind of an outpouring and a manifestation of the divine. So there is a dream dreaming us, and the dreamer is God. And we are denizens in God's dream. I like to say sometimes that life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. So basically, there's just nested dreams, and we're at various levels of the dream. And the trick about coming awake is to learn how to ascend through that hierarchy of dreaming until finally you merge with Source itself. And that's the final Namaste. So one of the images that came to me when I was thinking about this retreat was that the Namaste is like identical twins separated at incarnation, now meeting and knowing each other through what I would call psychic soul sensing. So imagine twin kids separated at birth and meeting each other, and there's this instant psychic soul sensing recognition. That's what happens when you say Namaste, when you're recognizing the divine, the Christ consciousness in another person. So the difficulty for us is that in our journey of devolution, and I'll talk much more about this in the days ahead, God willing. And one of the things I'll do, I will repeat some things several times, because the essence of learning, I believe, is twofold. It is repetition and feedback. Without feedback, we don't learn. If you go into an English pub and you're throwing darts, at the dartboard, and I were to hang a sheet in the middle of the room and ask you to throw the darts over the board, over the sheet at the board, which you can't see, you're not getting any feedback. You have no idea where your dart is landing. So feedback is essential in order to learn something, and repetition. So I will do that in the course of this retreat, feedback, and repetition, so that we kind of cover the ground. Now, in this journey of devolution, we all start as an idea in God's soul. And so then we devolve down through the various dimensions until finally we have abandoned our inner divinity and we find ourselves in these dense three-dimensional space suits. And we undergo 4 limitations. When we agree to incarnation in this 3D reality, we forfeit our cosmic selves for these little, in my case, 150-pound space suit. That's the first limitation. The second one is that we have to forfeit our cosmic intelligence, for this little 3-pound mass of wetware that we carry between our ears. The third thing is that since this is so small, it cannot grok the entire gestalt of our experiences. So we have to break up our experiences into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. So time is an illusion. It's an illusion of 3-dimensional reality. And then fourthly, we have amnesia for who we are, where we came from, and what our mission is. And now we're operating in these dense space suits. And the journey and the target is to remember more and more and more until finally we ascend over several lifetimes perhaps, or if you're really lucky, in a single lifetime, to get to the place where you recognize and you can literally say to an oak tree and to a kitty cat and a bunny rabbit, the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. You're God as a cat, you're God as an oak tree, and I'm God as ÓLaoire. So section 1 then on your handouts here, I called it the mystical science of naming. And I believe that in some ways, ancient peoples were much closer to truth than is modern science and monotheistic religions, because ancient peoples recognized the divinity of nature itself, including Pachamama. We give it a name, Pachamama, or Gaia. And so sun worshippers and moon worshippers, there was a point to what they were doing. They weren't just these crazy people who thought that the sun was divine or God was divine. There's a much, much deeper level to that. Because in their study of astronomy and astrology, they were meeting very, very deep realities. Astronomy is the study of the cosmos spelled with a C, which is the physical universe. And astrology is the study of the metaphysical universe. The Greeks spelled that with a K. K-O-S-M-O-S. So for the Greeks, the cosmos with a C was the physical universe, and the cosmos with a K was the metaphysical, of which the physical was simply a printout. And so deep, deep, deep astrology is the study of the metaphysical universe, of which the physical universe itself is simply a hard copy. So these ancient peoples understood that, and we regard them as just simple pagans who had no complex scientific model, or were kind of, polytheists who didn't realize there was only one God. Now, the interesting thing is that the sun and the moon exert extraordinary influences on us, not just physiologically, but psychologically, and I would say spiritually as well. So it's a fact that there is more information beamed onto planet Earth in 5 minutes of sunshine than is contained in all the libraries and all the archives of the planet right now. There's more data given to us by 5 minutes of sunshine than all the data in all our libraries and all our archives right now. And I believe that's why evolution happens on planet Earth, that the beings on planet Earth are constantly being upgraded by information which is beamed at us through solar energy. So these ancient peoples who were sun worshippers, they weren't just simply worshipping something they didn't understand. They weren't just these polytheistic morons who were delving into mythology. There were people who had a deep, deep, deep recognition of the metaphysical, where we're kind of focused totally on the physical. Now, with religion then, unfortunately, came the subjugation of nature. And with science came the near extinction of nature. Could I just ask everybody just to check that your cell phones are off? For 2 reasons, for the noise level and for EMF radiation as well, just to tap down the EMF radiation. So in the very first book of the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Genesis, God allegedly gives humanity control over nature. The word that's used in Hebrew is radah, I give you Radha over nature. Now, Radha has three very different meanings in Hebrew. Radha can mean to have dominion over. It can mean to exploit, or it can mean to be responsible for. So it has three very different meanings. To control, to exploit, or to be responsible for. And guess which one we took? We've been exploiting it and controlling it ever since. So again and again and again, we're kind of destroying nature. I don't know how many of you are aware of the kind of the chemtrail phenomenon, where they're somehow trying to deny sunlight to the planet, which is a totally crazy notion. If data are being beamed onto us by the sun, that our evolutionary trajectory can proceed, why would you cut us off from that source? And when you do that, you're denying chlorophyll, which is the origin of all life on the planet. All plants need chlorophyll. And the herbivores need plants, and the carnivores need, herbivores, and the omnivores need carnivores. So you're cutting off the life cycle. So again and again and again, in our chutzpah, we're kind of trying to control and despoil nature. The ancients people didn't do that. You have the notion then of domesticating animals, and allegedly, at one stage, all animals were wild, and then we began domesticating them in various ways and naming them. Now, there's something really, really important here. God told Adam that he should name the animals, but we misunderstand what naming is. We think that naming is calling the dog Fido or the cat Suki or whatever. Naming is not that. Naming is having a deep personal understanding of the essence of the one with whom you're in contact. To name somebody is to have a deep relationship with the essence of the other. It's not hanging an identity tag on a cow's ear, and naming it. So it's interesting to me that in the West, farmers in the West have, a herd of 100 cows with numbers stapled on their ears. They have no idea the individual cows except the numbers. I lived in Kenya for 14 years, and the Kipsigis people and the Maasai people, they had individual names on every single one of the cattle. They knew every one of the cattle by name. And so this notion of naming, we don't understand what naming is about. It's not about an identity tag. In fact, I believe that I got this in a dream at one stage, that the last thing that grandmother God whispers to us when a soul is ready to parachute into human incarnation, the last thing that grandmother God whispers in your ear is your secret, sacred name. And it's not Sean or Maura or Michael or whatever. It's not a name like that. It's the music of your soul. And when you understand and you recognize your real name, the music of your soul, then you understand what your mission is. And so part of the journey into spirituality is to try to remember who you are. Not just the name given you when somebody poured water over your head, but what was the name that grandmother God whispered in your ear when you volunteered to come down here and you winged your way into incarnation. So naming is really, really important. And that's the reason why in the book of Exodus, when Moses has an encounter at the burning bush, and a voice says to him, I want you to go back into Egypt and set my people free. Tell him your God has come back to set you free. This God has been missing in action for 430 years since the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, allegedly. And Moses says, which God are you? If I go back and say to the people, your God sent me back to tell you you're to be set free. And they say to me, which God are you talking about? What will I tell them? And God says in Hebrew, Ehiya Ashir Ehiya, which is always mistranslated. Always you hear it translated as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You can't say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a device called predication without a verb. And we have the same thing in some of the Kalenjin languages. So if I want to say in Hebrew, I am the king, what I say is, Ani hamelech, me, king. But there's no present tense of the verb to be. Now there's a present tense of all the other verbs in the language, and there are all the other tenses of the verb to be, but there's no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. In other words, you can't make God a static reality. So what God actually said was, Ehiya Ashir Ehiya, I will be who I will be. He uses a future tense. In other words, God says, I will show up in whatever way I choose to show up. You can't make a picture of me, or you can't ground me in a particular kind of reality. Say, oh, that I understand this God right now. God is a shapeshifter par excellence. God will show up in whatever way he chooses to show up in any particular circumstance. Now, we've gone then from, what we've done is just basically name species. Oh, they're cows, or they're ants, or they're antelopes, or whatever. When you go from naming a species to naming an individual within the species, then you've gone from othering to brothering. Now you're in a personal relationship with an individual member of the species that you're in contact with. So having a name for a pet, for instance, you've got a totally different relationship in the West with your cat or your dog, than you have with the cows in the fields, because you know the name of it. And the name is not just, the tag that you hung on the particular cat or dog, but you've got this deep relationship. You know the essence, the character of this particular animal, and that's what you're resonating with. So that's what I would say about that section 1. Section 2, then, the soul pod. I believe that we all come into life, we make what I call preconception contracts. That group of souls migrate from lifetime to lifetime with each other, and we're like a Shakespearean troupe. That this year we put on Hamlet, next year we put on A Midsummer's Night Dream, next year we put on Macbeth. So I believe we come in as soul pods. We're like a Shakespearean troupe that moves from village to village, putting on a play, and then next year we put on a different play. It's the same group of players, but we're playing totally different roles, and that's what happens in Incarnation. Each incarnation is the same soul pod coming together. So, we'll play different roles with different genders, different abilities, different IQ levels, different socioeconomic status, whatever. These are incidental to the incarnation. But you're going to recognize your tribe. No matter how late in life you meet them, you might be 40 years of age before you meet somebody that you recognize as part of, there's something about this person, this is not our first rodeo together. And so I call that the soul pod. Now, there was a very special soul pod came in 2,000 years ago, I believe. And according to the apocryphal Gospel of Philip, it says, there were 3 who always walked with the Lord, and all 3 were called Mary. There was Mary, his mother, and then there's a mix-up in the text. There was Mary, it's either his sister or Mary's sister, so it's either Jesus, sister, Mary's sister, or Jesus' aunt, and Mary of Magdala. So there were 3 who always walked with the Lord, according to the Gospel of Philip, the apocryphal Gospel of Philip, and they're all called Mary. Mary, his mother, Mary, his companion, Mary of Magdala, and then the other Mary, who was either a sister of his mother, and therefore his aunt, or his sister. It's not clear from the text. Now, I think then that was a core part of the soul pod, and then there was Jesus, and then there were 2 Johns. There were John the Beloved, whom we think, then took Mary, the mother of Jesus, into his care when Jesus had been crucified. And then there's John the Baptist, who was the first cousin of Jesus. So that's part of the soul pod. And then there's the 12 disciples who came in around the same time. Even Judas is part of that soul pod. Because I think we draw from both a soul pod and what I call a shadow pod. People who are going to test us. That we're all going to be we're all going to have people in our lives who really test us. And they're important because weeders are as important as fertilizers in your life. If we only had fertilizers in our lives, we'd all become narcissists. If we only had, weeders in our lives, we'd have no self-esteem. So there's always going to be a mixture of weeders and fertilizers in our lives to make sure that we grow. So Judas is part of this group. Now, there are then concentric rings. It's like you drop a rock in a pool of water and the ripples spread out. And no matter how irregular the perimeter of the pool is, the ripples will reach every single part of the perimeter at some stage. So in some senses, every single one of us is part of an extended soul pod with Jesus at the core of it. And this becomes really important then for the understanding of Christ consciousness. So all of us are part of this soul pod. We've come in at different stages. Section 3 then I call good cop, bad cop. There's this naive notion then in some spiritual circles that some souls volunteer to be bad guys so that others of us could learn to be good guys. So you get this notion, for instance, that Herod and Pilate and Judas and Hitler were actually good guys who said, sign me up for the hard parts so that other people can learn the good parts. But for me, that's total rubbish. I do not believe that Herod or Pilate or Judas or Hitler were good guys, and they were not necessary guys who volunteered to be villains in order to stretch the rest of us in order to achieve God's plans. I do not believe that for a minute. They are simply, these characters, they're simply like the rest of us. They're players acting in accordance with their own level of spiritual development and thus creating a specific timeline that we call history. They didn't sign up to be bad guys out of the goodness of their heart. They came in where they were at in their spiritual evolution, and they acted from that place like every single one of us acted from the place in which we incarnated on the basis of previous incarnations and the spiritual growth that we accomplished during that time. So then, attendant on that, did Jesus come to be crucified then? Did Jesus choose or come to be crucified? And I believe he absolutely did not. He came on a mission, and it was his extraordinary spiritual intelligence that directed him in every situation to make the necessary loving choices dedicated to the final outcome of the enlightenment of all beings. He did not choose crucifixion. He came in at a period of human history knowing that, given the place he parachuted into and the times into which he parachuted, that as a public figure, advocating a totally different kind of spirituality, that he was likely to run into trouble with his religious religious figures and the secular forces of Roman occupation at the time. And if he got into trouble, there was a good likelihood that crucifixion would be the last act of the drama. But he did not come in and say, sign me up for crucifixion. He came in for a very different mission, and unfortunately, given the time he came and the place in which he came, it always became inevitable that would be the end. But this was not the purpose. Jesus could have lived to be the age of 80, like the Buddha did. Jesus could have been a grandfather dandling his granddaughter on his knee, and he would have been no less effective than he was the way he died. Because it was the way he lived and the way he died that was the kind of the icon for us to follow. Now, I believe then that within the game of life, each one of us agrees to particular kinds of constraints, the constraints of incarnation. And some people come in as bodhisattvas, like a Jesus figure. And the bodhisattva is, according to Buddhism, is the person who's worked off all their own personal karma. There is no need for them to come back again. There's nothing more they can learn from incarnation on planet Earth. Maybe they'll incarnate in a 5-dimensional reality or a 9-dimensional reality, but they've learned everything they can learn from being 3-dimensional beings. But they see the state of our world and they volunteer, they send me, I'll come back, in order to wake up the rest of us. So the bodhisattva is the soul who doesn't need to be in 3D anymore, but has volunteered to come back to help everybody else. And that's the Jesus figure. Jesus is a bodhisattva figure, to use kind of a Buddhist language from it. Now, I believe then that Pilate and Judas were not programmed into this, and they weren't even necessary in order for Jesus to fulfill his mission. They simply experienced their own trajectory. They're souls like you are and I am, who came in with their previous level of spiritual evolution, and they're dropped into a particular phase of human history, and they act out from what they're able to do. They make their own choices, and the choices, impact everybody else. But they did not volunteer for this. So this naive notion that Pilate and Judas were necessary and that Jesus chose to have them in order to fulfill his mission, for me, that's mishigas. Now, when we parachute in then, we realize that we're making a choice for a particular kind of game. There is total free will. I'll mention that a little bit later. I'll get onto free will. We have total free will coming in here. Once we're here, we have limitations, but we freely chose to come. So let me use the example right now. If you want to get into a sports and you're looking, should I be playing soccer or baseball or basketball or an Irish game called hurling, which do you want to play? You have to decide, well, there are totally different rules. If you play NFL football, the ball is going to look a particular shape. If you're playing baseball, it's a totally different kind of a ball. There are totally different rules. If you play soccer, only one person in the team can handle the ball, the goalkeeper. And if you decide to play American football, you can tackle somebody, knock them to the ground. Try that in soccer, and you get taken off the field. Or baseball, you get taken off the field. So you decide which game you want to play. But once you decide on the game you want to play, you have to abide by the rules of that particular game. And the rules of each game are different. And the rules of 3-dimensional reality, we know what they are before we come. So we have total free will about our choice of game. But when we come in, we're then subject to what all the other players in this particular game are doing. So some of us, it feels like we don't have free will. We do have free will. We've chosen the game, but we've chosen to abide by the rules of the game. And so it's not that we lack free will, it's we're here by choice. So that's the difference for me between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. There's a huge difference. And so the trajectory of incarnation is to learn to move from free will to freedom, to make all choices out of love. Now, when we parachute into this game, all of the participants in the game interact with each other. And so there are, the participants and the kind of the forces, put stresses on any individual person so that when we're making our choices, they don't appear to be free. They're free because we've chosen the game, but everybody else in the game is making choices that affect the possibilities of choices you're making. And so, for instance, the participants in our game in 3D dimensional reality, they're human, they're animal, they're sentient beings, they're even viruses. Viruses have an effect, on the choices we're going to make, in these particular lifetimes. And there are forces that we have to contend with. Some of them are off-planetary forces, and some of them are on-planetary forces. So on the planet, we're dealing with rain and snow and wind and hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes. And there are forces that are impacting, the choices we're able to make. And then there are off-planetary kind of influences like lunar activity, solar activity, galactic activity, cosmic activity. All of these have an effect on ours. I spent a year in London at one stage, and I decided to study astrology for a year, just for the fun of it, to see what it was like. And the textbook they used, I still remember on the flyleaf of the textbook, it said, "You are not who you are because you were born when you were born. Rather, you were born when you were born because you were meant to be who you are." So it's not that you're born. I was born in Cork at 1 p.m. on the 8th of October 1946 in a hospital, and my fate is sealed right now. It's not that. It's that I chose to come into planet Earth at that stage, in that place, because I had a particular mission that I had signed up for. And so for me then, astrology, properly understood, is not that we're victims of kind of what the stars and the suns and the moons are doing, but rather that the intelligence of the cosmos has conspired to create a signal that say, okay, here's your mission this time around. Section 4, then I want to talk about parallel timelines. I do not believe that there is any such thing as a predetermined inevitable future, only probable futures and possible futures. I believe then that other timelines exist in which one or many of all the players made different decisions, that there's a multiplicity of timelines. And you can experience alternative timelines by entering into higher states of consciousness. And so this is what happens to you when you're dreaming at night. I think there's a cross-fertilization of timelines that are happening. And so you'll sometimes experience yourself in a house and you say, oh, I was in my own home. But it's not like any home I ever lived in, in this incarnation. So you're having encounters with people you've never met in this incarnation and places you've never been in this incarnation. And so what's happening for me is that these timelines are cross-fertilizing. So it's like parallel processing to speed up the evolutionary trajectory of your soul. So you can access these timelines, I believe, in your dreams, in your visions, and in your imagination. And I differentiate between imagination and fantasy. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift your state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, interact with different entities and different energies, learn from them, and bring it back and cross-fertilize it with your waking state. So imagination is the greatest talent of a scientist, of a prophet, and of an artist, and of little children up to about the age of 7 or 8 until we educate them. So past lives then, I believe, what we call past lives may well be alternative, current, parallel timelines. And so the fact that I think there is only the now, time is an illusion in some senses. Several years ago, somebody gave me a gift of a CD player that I could plug into my computer, a kind of a disc that I could plug in. I put it in and an icon popped up and there was a music video with 13 tracks on it. So there was a button, I hit the button, and it plays them in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I went through the entire thing. And then I saw another button, it said shuffle. I hit the shuffle button, and now it played them in a random order. And then there was a third one, and it said, put your own order on it. And so being a mathematician, I decided I want to play all of the prime numbers first, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and 13. And then the even numbers, 4, 6, 8, 12, and then number 1. And that's the order in which I play them. And then finally I said, what would happen if I could play all 13 tracks simultaneously? What would it sound like? And obviously to my 3D ear, it would be utter cacophony. But I realized If I were operating at a 5D or a 6D level, this would be absolute synchrony. I would be able to kind of process all of them together as if they were simply different musical instruments in an orchestra. Rather than clashing with each other, there'd be this extraordinary orchestral symphony. And so that in some senses, these timelines that we experience are literally, they're different tracks on the same CD. And the question is, can I get into that level of consciousness where they don't result in cacophony, but rather in symphony? So I believe then that we have 7 different timelines. We have 2 times in the past, 2 times in the present, and 3 times in the future. So the 2 past times are the actual past, what really happened, and that has influenced who we are. We're victims of that in some sense. And then there's the historical past, what the winners wrote down about the past, and we're victims of that as well. So we're hugely influenced by what actually happened, but we don't know of it, and then what we're told happened, or the history books told us, and we're influenced by both. So there's 2 versions of the past. Then there are 2 versions of the present. There's what's actually happening in our world right now, and we're hugely influenced by it. And then there's the propaganda telling us what's happening in the world right now, and they can be radically different, and we're hugely influenced by that. So we got 2 versions of the present. And then allegedly there are 3 versions of the future. There's the inevitable fated outcome over which we have no control. Now, I totally reject that model. I do not believe that that actually exists. But a lot of people believe we're stuck, we have no control over it, we're going to hell in a handbasket. I believe rather that there are 2 versions of the future as well. There's the probable future, which is likely to happen if we don't change what we're doing. And then there's the possible future, which can happen if we do change what we're doing. And so the function of the prophet then is not to foretell the future. It is to forestall the future. The job of the prophet is not to predict the future, it is to prevent the future. Because the prophet sees very, very clearly the probable future given on present behavior. And the prophet is constantly trying to call us back into alignment with the covenant of God to create an alternative possible future. And that's the job of all the prophets, not to predict, but to protect us against it. So God then, I believe, only has one agenda, and that is all souls finally align with love. I don't believe God plays partisan politics in any way, whether it's in a ball game, a boxing match, or in cultural affairs. That God's only interest is, eventually, I want all of my children to realize that the only thing that exists is love. There is only God, and there is only love. Everything that exists is literally God and drag, literally. Everything that exists is God and drag. And when we wake up to that, we can say Namaste, and then things will begin to change. So let me say something a little bit more about free will and freedom, section 5. So I viewed the example of ball games and the fact that you can choose to play any ball game you want, but once you choose the ball game, you agree to abide by the rules. And the rules are radically different, from ball game to ball game. The costumes are different, the hymns are different, the rules are different, the numbers of players are different, the size of the ball is different, everything is different. But you freely chose a particular game. But once you chose it, you agree, okay, I'll abide by the rules of this game. So now we find ourselves in a game called ÓLaoire, the game of creation, according to Hinduism, the game of 3D reality. And we agreed freely to come down here. We volunteered for this level of reality. And there are particular rules that we engage with. And part of the rules, it says, we're operating with this tiny little, 3-pound mass of wetware that we carry between our ears in order to try to grok the entire gestalt. Now, as you well know at this stage, if you attempt to play a game of chess against a computer, you're going to be outclassed immediately. Because a computer can calculate, trillions of possible outcomes of the board as it exists right now. At any stage, the human player has a very limited number of moves that can be made, given on the particular pieces. A knight can only move in a particular fashion. A pawn can only go out and move in a particular fashion. A king can only go one space at a time. A knight can jump. A castle can only go straight lines. A bishop can only go diagonally. And so there are constraints on how you can move. But the computer can foretell for trillions of moves out, what the likely outcomes of what you're doing right now. But we're stuck. And so that's the problem with free will right now, that we as human players have a tiny little laptop, and the universe is this extraordinary machine that can predict with infinite numbers of possibilities, what you could do 100 moves on the road and already beat you before you begin. And so we're engaged in a game of chess. and we're playing against a machine. And the machine is that we have these extraordinary limitations. But we volunteered to be here anyway. And we volunteered to come here, I believe, and there's 3 levels to the mission. The first level to the mission is to wake myself up to Christ consciousness, to wake myself up to realization that I too am a holographic fractal of Source. I'm a bite-sized piece of God. And then to look around me and to offer Namaste to every one of my brothers and sisters and say to you, you are a holographic fractal of God. And so we have to help each other to wake up to Christ consciousness. And then we're going to find our tribe, however we find them and however late in life we find them. And we're going to recognize the people in our tribe, recognize people who are dedicated to coming awake. And then we can offer Namaste to each other culturally and create groups that act as a leaven so that finally we can raise the entire culture to Christ consciousness. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's open it up to Q&A. I've been asked to repeat all the questions for the tape to make sure that they're heard. So the question is, why would we choose to be in one situation, you're well off, you're well cared for, you're happy. In another situation, there's terrible suffering happening. It's a great question. So here are some of the responses to it. The first response is that there's a huge difference between pain and suffering. The Buddha said famously one time, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. So pain is the price of incarnation. We choose to come into a world in which there are volcanoes and suffering and aging and death and warfare. But the suffering comes from the kind of the stories we tell about the pain we're experiencing. So there's a huge difference between pain and suffering. In my office in Los Altos for many years, where I was doing clinical psychology, I was threatening to put up a notice on my door that would say, change the bloody story. Because week after week after week, a client would come in and it's the same story. You know, I'm saying to you, as long as you're telling yourself the same story, you're going to have the same problems. Change the story already. And so it's the interpretations we foist on the pain we're experiencing. So that's the first answer. The second answer is, without suffering, we would never learn to develop compassion. If there were no suffering in the world, there would be no compassion available. Each of us would be self-engrossed narcissists. If everything was hunky-dory and there was no suffering, either internally or that we witness outside, we would not develop compassion. So it's very important to develop compassion. The third thing is that, given that we're eternal beings signing up for a very tiny little slice of time in which we experience vicissitudes of various kinds, that's a tiny way of testing ourselves. Because each of us needs to experience a situation in which we can learn to love in all circumstances. So if in one incarnation I've been born into a millionaire family with great health, you know, and all the benefits of that, how can I learn to love in that circumstance? I can, and I need to, but it'll be one kind of loving. If I decide to be born into a handicapped body, a Down syndrome's little child, you know, what am I learning about love in that instance? I'm learning something very different from that, and I need to learn that. What do I learn if I decide I want to be born as a slave girl in the 13th century in North Africa? How am I going to learn to love from that? And I do learn to love from that. And so until I've managed to kind of taste the various ways of being human and learning how to love in each version of that, I haven't graduated from Earth School. And so the pain and the suffering is not is not the downside of life, it's the lesson side of life. Important for all of us. Okay, so Kim's question then is about, was it necessary for Jesus to die the way he did in order to do to kind of offer salvation or Christ consciousness? Or was he doing this for the rest of us? I do not believe, as I said, I do not believe that Jesus signed up to be crucified. I believe he signed up to kind of initiate a Christ consciousness movement or an enlightenment movement into the world. And that I think that the same character whom we know as Jesus of Nazareth was also the Buddha 550 years before that. That the same soul incarnated 550 years before his Jewish incarnation in an Indian subcontinent, you know, and it appeared as the Buddha. I think that there have been several times throughout human history when this extraordinary soul has incarnated. And each time it's a different culture, you know, and it's a different milieu, and there's a different cohort group, or at least they're in a different situation, different culture, but the objective is the same. It is to move the stuck wheels of human evolution, to move from our 3D identification into the Christ consciousness movement. So would we have Eucharist now? Would there be breads with the cross carved on it? it's very important that we learn how to reinterpret all of the metaphors and all of the archetypes. An archetype is it comes from the fourth level of a body. So you start with the gross body, then the etheric body, then the astral body, and then the mental body. And the mental body is the place of archetypes. And the archetypes are the ideal forms. So Plato talked about the archetypes. So the archetypes then, when I think of the archetype of the cross, and I'm going to do one lecture on this later in this week. When I think about the cross, I think basically about two versions of the cross. So here's the cross with a vertical arm and a horizontal arm. So allegedly, it's an instrument of torture where Jesus was crucified. And indeed, it was that. Historically, it was that. But for me, what it represents is this, that the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. God in his utter ineffability and God in her immanence that can be experienced. So the vertical arm represents that connection. And the horizontal arm of the cross represents what Native American Indian tradition would call all my relations. Everything that exists in the cosmos is my relationship. And the intersection point is this blink of individual consciousness that I call Seán and you call Kim. And so in some senses, we are the intersection of where the transcendence of God and immanence of God meet the creation in all ways. So that's one meaning of the cross. There's a second meaning of cross, and there's many more that I'll talk about later in the week. But the second one for me, I call it the cross of resurrection. And the disciples of Jesus Christ after the resurrection had a big problem trying to explain to people that Jesus really rose from the dead. You know, how can we persuade you that he did? So they got two problems. And so the first problem is that, you know, they're trying to persuade them it was the very same Jesus we met before he died and after he died. He ate bread, he ate a piece of fish, you know, he came back, he ate with us. You know, we put our hands into the nail marks and our fingers into his side. It was really the same Jesus. But on the other hand, there was something totally different about him. He was able to pass through walls. He was able to appear and disappear. So there's both this kind of transcendent and immanent aspect to Jesus. So I call that the cross of resurrection. There's the kind of the before above, that there's something transformed about him. And there's the before after, which is the horizontal arm of the cross, before he died and after he rose from the dead. So now you've got two versions of the cross right there. So the importance about archetypes and metaphors is that depending on the state of consciousness with which you exegete them, you're getting totally different messages. And this is why Jesus will constantly speak in parables to his audiences, because there are three kinds of listeners to what Jesus is saying. There are those who are unpacking what he says literally. There are those who are unpacking what he says symbolically, and there are those who are unpacking what he says mystically. So who are they? The literalists are those who are processing with their left brain kind of rationality. So when Jesus says it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven, the left brain says this is crazy talk. So literalism will not get his message. The symbolist is going to try to go to the right part of the brain, and say this is symbolic language. So I'm going to go into my creativity here and try to unpack it in a creative fashion. But the mysticist is going to go out of the brain completely and unpack it at the level of the heart and the soul. So the mystic is hearing this same parable at a soul level and a heart level, where the symbolist is hearing it in the right brain, the literist is hearing it in the left brain, and there's three totally different messages, apparently. But there's only one message. It's only a question of who's exegeting it, who's interpreting the message. So when you take any great metaphor or any great archetype like the cross, and as I say, I'll talk more about it throughout the week, it depends then on what mind are you in? Are you left brain? Are you right brain? Are you outside your brain in your heart space and in your soul self? Yeah. Johannes' question was asking about the importance of sunlight. Like I said, that the records show that there's more information transmitted to planet Earth in 5 minutes of sunshine than is contained in all the archives of the planet. And you mentioned water as well. The two greatest kind of archives of data and information are water and light. So we know from quantum mechanics that all matter is frozen light. We know that for a scientific fact. All matter is frozen light. And so at the quantum mechanical level, when you're dealing with light, you're dealing with the information encoded. Now, there's a very interesting differentiation then between data and information. If I give you the alphabet, I give you in English 26 data points, 26 different symbols, but there's no information contained in that. However, if I give you just 4 of the letters, I give you E, I, L, V. I give you 4 letters. What can you make out of that? You can make live out of it, live. You can make evil out of it. You can make vile out of it. So you can organize those data into information. So information is the organization of data. So that becomes really important. Or in mathematics, if I give you a bunch of letters and I said, like A, B, C, X, you know, and a bunch of mathematical kind of symbols, plus, minus, square root, division, you know, they're all just data points. They're meaningless. But if I said X is equal to minus B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC over 2A, I've just given you the formula for a quadratic equation. So now you've transferred data into information. And so both light and water are the main archives of data, which then get translated into information, you know, by human ingenuity. And so you get guys then like, I think Masaru Emoto, this Japanese scientist, you know, who took water crystals, you know, and had signs on them, love or hate, or had a real kind of heavy rock metal or classical music, and then watched the crystallization process, and it was radically different. And so in my drinking water, and what I use for drinking water, I have the word love written across the front of it. And so it becomes really important then to realize that we're surrounded by an information influx. And why in God's name would we cut off the source of that? Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why would we pollute our water, and why would we cut off our sunlight if these are the main sources, you know, of information and data being piled onto the planet? So the question is, the term holographic fractal, could I unpack that a little bit? So a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. So if you have a holographic photograph, you know, and you cut off a corner of it, and you subject it to laser light, the entirety of the original photograph is contained in the tiny little slice that you cut off. So that would be a hologram, where the totality of the original is contained in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is simply a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So I just give you examples of that. For instance, if you take a kind of, you take an atom with a nucleus, you know, an atom spinning around it, and then so that's a pattern. And then you upgrade that to, let's say, a planet with moons circling it. That's the same pattern repeated. And then you take a sun with planets spinning around it. And then you take a galaxy with solar systems spinning around it. And then you take a black hole in space with galaxies spinning around it. And so you get the same pattern repeating at an infinite number of scales. And there are beautiful mathematical models like the Mandelbrot that you can derive with very, very simple mathematical equations. And you create these extraordinary, beautiful visual patterns, which is the same pattern repeating again and again and again. A very simple one is if you take a triangle, and in each of the sides, you build a smaller triangle. And in each of those, you build smaller triangles. So it's the very same pattern repeating again and again and again. It's simply, you know, triangles. But the visual impact of it is brilliant. And then you get some really complex ones like the Mandelbrot, which is it's like eye-popping when you see it. So that's what a fractal is. So what do I mean then when I use the term holographic fractal? I mean that everything that exists is a holographic fractal of God. The totality of God is contained in every part of creation, literally, from an oak tree to a bunny rabbit, to a cell, to a human being, to a galaxy. There is no place where God is not. And so the only question is then, can I access a state of consciousness in which I can apprehend those data? Because those data are there. The question is, can I organize those data into information and therefore read what the message is? And the message is, there is only God and there is only love. Everything else is mishigas. It's made up. So the question is then, she can understand that, you know, maybe people like Pilate or Judas did not sign up for this to be the bad guys, so the rest of us could be good guys. But what happens if there are external forces, you know, at a cultural level or at a global level or outside the globe that are influencing affairs on planet Earth? So I told you that I've seeded my dreams for many, many years. A few years ago, I asked in my dream for a distinction between sin and evil. And in the dream, what I got was, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. Evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So for me, there's a huge difference between them. Sin is simply breaking a human law. Evil is a cosmic-wide conspiracy, sometimes using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So there's there's literally a cosmic battle going on, and you read this in all the great mystical traditions. We're foolish to think that we are the only life form in the universe itself, and that there are not much more advanced beings than we. Now, in one of the lectures this week, I'll talk about the difference between Ahriman, and Lucifer, that notion. And so, in my understanding then is that there are many, many advanced beings with different levels of intelligence, but increased intelligence doesn't necessarily coordinate with increased morality. So there's a difference, for instance, between science and conscience. The word conscience actually, is a conscientia. In the Latin languages, conscientia means that which goes along with science. So conscience is that which is meant to go along with science. So science is the ability to manipulate the physical cosmos, and it should be driven by conscientia, the morality that goes along with the kinds of abilities we have to create at various levels. And so we're in a situation where I believe that there are cosmic beings who are interested, who are feeding off human distress. The example I use sometimes, imagine going to a bullfight where you watch somebody torture an animal to death to kill it, and the whole crowd is applauding. Or you watch, cockfighting, putting roosters to kill each other, and guys are putting bets and cheering. Or you watch dog fighting, we have two dogs savaging each other, and people are getting off energetically on that. And that people are literally feeding on the distress of the animals who are being tortured. Now, I think it is possible that there are beings outside of this dimension who are using warfare in order to feed themselves emotionally, that their food is human distress, and that they're fomenting wars of various kinds, and that's their food. And so the fact that they're more intelligent and have greater technology doesn't mean that they're more moral than us, because with greater power comes greater temptation. And that was the great fall of maybe the Lucifer, non serviam, I will not serve. So this is a much bigger battle than just what's happening, even in our country or in our planet. And in the scriptures you read that Paul says very famously in his letter to the Ephesians, our battle is not just against the forces of darkness in this present world, but in the powers of the heavens. And Jesus would talk about the same thing. He would talk about the world is the word that he used for it, but by the world, Jesus meant the dark forces that are manipulating. And so this is a much more complex phenomenon and equation than we give it credit for. And so the Judases of the world and the Hitlers of the world, in some senses, are small fry in the hands of bigger forces with whom they have made Faustian agreements. You give me power, and you can have my soul at the end of it. And all great cultures, we have a great story. You'll remember this one came in Irish schools. One of our textbooks was called Scéal Héana. Sheana was an Irish character who made a Faustian agreement, with the devil for benefits in his physical life. So power always runs the risk of making Faustian agreements, and these agreements are with, I believe, off-planetary forces sometimes. So it's a much bigger equation. Now, I think there are forces of light which are much more powerful, and I know that the forces of light ultimately will prevail. But we're in a period of life in which, so let me extend myself in this a little bit. There's a great Czechoslovakian psychiatrist called Stan Grof. Have you heard of Stan Grof? Yeah. Stan Grof had a theory. One of his theories was called perinatal matrices. And the perinatal matrices is a belief system that there are 4 dangerous times in the birthing process for every child. And depending on which stage proves most difficult, there will be corresponding adult neurotic behavior that corresponds with the difficulty. And so the 4 stages, he said, the 4 matrices, the first one is, the womb experience itself. Is it a happy womb or a difficult womb? Is the mother well nurtured and in a a stable relationship, or is she being subject to violence? Is she doing drugs? So what's the environment in the womb for the child like, for the first 9 months? So that's matrix number 1. Is it a good womb or a bad womb? The second one is, the contractions have begun. The ceiling is coming down, the floor is coming up, the walls are coming in, but the cervix is still closed, so there's no way out. And the child is freaking out, he's been crushed to death, and there's no exit. That's matrix number 2. Matrix number 3 is the cervix is now open, and the child is spelunking down through the birth canal. But this can take anywhere from 2 hours to 48 hours, and there's no guarantee the child will arrive live. And then the 4th one, matrix, the child is out, the umbilical cord is cut, he's slapped on the tush, and there's bright lights and no noise. So depending on which stage of that process, it's especially difficult for the child. There'll be corresponding adult neurotic behavior. That was Stan Grof's belief system. Now, I take that much further. I think that's true, not just at an individual level. I think it's true at a global level. I think that our planet itself is a womb that's attempting to birth Christ consciousness. And the question is it a good womb or a bad womb right now? What is it like to be on planet Earth right now? And the second question is then, when the contractions begin, and the contractions have begun, how are we dealing with the contractions? The third stage will be when the opening presents itself, and we have to start spelunking. We're going to need doulas and midwives for this process, and they're the light workers among us or at the other side of the veil. And then the fourth stage is now we've emerged. We're in a brand new world. We have no idea what it is. We haven't been prepared for it. A child outside the womb is having a totally different experience from a child inside the womb. How in God's name can I kind of live in this outside here? And so that's where we're at right now, I believe. That we're at this stage. The contractions have begun. I think the cervix is opening. I think the birthing is beginning. And I think now at this stage, there are doulas who are being called. And these are the Christ-conscious beings at both sides of the veil who are enfleshed right now. They're incarnate beings like us and beings at the other side who are trying to move this process forward. But it becomes really, really important that these are not doulas of doom. That there's, oh my God, you're never going to make it. No, the baby's head is being crushed. Oh my God, this is terrible. We have to be doulas that kind of appreciate what's happening and encourage the mother to give birth. And the mother is the human community right now. So do you want to be doulas or naysayers? That's our choice. So Amy's question is, if we agree to be light workers, and align with the purpose of being doulas to birth this new world, are we now inviting kind of interference from the outside, from darker forces? And the answer is yes, we are. And the response is that, we must protect ourselves constantly. So I have a practice at night. When I go to bed at night, one of the last prayers I say is, I want to be protected in my travels during the night, because I'm going to be going through the astral belt, in my consciousness. And the astral belt has two levels. It has the lower astral level and the higher astral level. And the lower astral level is the place of discombobulated entities, stuck souls, people who are addicted to planet Earth and need a physical body in order to indulge their addiction. Or the people who have been frightened by religion so that they're afraid of the afterlife and they want to move towards the light. And so it's a very dangerous place to kind of maneuver through. It's like the asteroid belt. If you're moving from Mars to Jupiter, you're going through a fractured, all these thousands of broken rocks. So you put a rocket through that, it's running the gauntlet. And so you're running the gauntlet when you go to bed at night and you dream. And so it's very important that you protect yourself in this journey. And so the prayer I say is, I pray to my guardian angels and to Mother Mary to protect me and to give me the courage and the ability to help souls who are in distress. But don't get me into stuff I can't handle. Don't allow me to bite off a bigger job than I'm equipped for. So I want to be of help, but I don't want to get into stuff I can't handle. So it becomes really, really important then, because you are going to get attacked. The doulas and the light workers are going to get attacked. Now, part of the journey is there's this beautiful Buddhist practice called Tonglen. And Tonglen is this notion where you consciously breathe in the pain of the world. And then you refine it in the compassion of your own heart. And then in the out breath, you exude compassion. So at every breath cycle, you're taking in the pain of the world. You're transforming it through Christ consciousness, and then you're exuding it in the breath, in the out breath. And they call that Tonglen. So it's a really, really, really beautiful practice. Now, I think it becomes really, really important for us then, because I certainly find in talking to people, and it's my experience as well, that sometimes when I'm sleeping, I have this level of anxiety that I know it doesn't belong to me. That I have my own anxieties, obviously, but there's a level of anxiety that I experience which I know is not mine. And I know it's that somehow, I am subject to what Buddhism will call the tulpas, the dark energetic forces that are created by human thought forms, my own thought forms and the thought forms of my culture. And so I'm being battered by those at night. Now, the question is, what do I do with that? And what I'm trying to do is transform it. I'm trying to use a Tonglen that says, okay, a lot of this stuff isn't mine, but I'm experiencing it as if it were mine. So what's the response? And the response is Tonglen. Let me breathe it in. I'm not going to try to get rid of it. I'm going to take it in. I'm going to try to translate and transform it, with love and compassion, and then breathe it out as love to the world. So it's the difference between what's sometimes called borderline personality disorder and borderland personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is a psychological condition where a child who has never been given their own safe space in a home, that they've been crowded out constantly, there's no privacy whatsoever, and they develop a borderline personality disorder, where they waver variously between good and bad, light and dark, hatred and love. Now, there's a symptom called borderland personality disorder where we take in the pain of the planet itself and we become conduits for the pain that the planet itself is experiencing. And then the response to that has to be some kind of tonglen, that to realize firstly, all of this anxiety is not my own. Some of it is, and I can recognize that, but probably 95% of this is not mine. So where's it coming from? It's coming from the anxiety of the planet right now. So what am I going to do? Am I going to reject it? Or am I going to try to refine it, work with it, and breathe it out as compassion? And the question is, I've talked a lot about learning, how do we learn? And particularly the constraints we agree to. How do we learn what constraints we agree to? The first thing is there are 4 basic constraints that all of us agree to. That to reduce cosmic self to this 150-pound spacesuit. The second one, cosmic intelligence to a laptop computer between my ears. Thirdly, the illusion of having to operate through time. And the fourth one is having to suffer amnesia for who I am, where I came, and what my purpose is. So there are constraints that every human being on the planet is subject to. Now, there are different ones, that we've agreed to as individuals. So I co-wrote a book, I think it was 2013, so about 12 years ago, called Why? What your life is telling you about who you are and why you're here. And I wrote it with 2 other psychologists, Matt McKay and a guy called Ralph Metzner. Ralph is now dead, brilliant psychologist. And in that book, I looked at, how are we equipped for incarnation? And basically we come with 2 kinds of gifts. The first kind of gifts are my talents. And my talents do not belong to me. They are gifts that God gave me to deliver to the world. I'm like a mailman with a bag of letters. Even if the bag is mine, the letters in the bag do not belong to me. They belong to the people whose names are in the envelopes. And my job is to deliver those envelopes. So the talents I have are the first indication of what my mission is. What are my talents? And there's an indication of what I've come to do. Now, I'm entitled to make a living for my talents, but I'm not entitled to make a killing for my talents because they do not belong to me. They were a free gift I was meant to deliver. The second kind of gift I came down with was my problems. I set myself some issues I wanted to learn in this particular incarnation. And to do that, I set particular problems in this incarnation, particular kinds of handicaps I'd have to deal with, whether it was a handicap of the family I was brought into, whether it was a physical handicap or a mental handicap or a socioeconomic handicap, whatever it was, because I wanted to grow myself. I was sharing with the group at the table tonight that in my time in Kenya, I remember one encounter I had with an old man. I was involved a lot in community development. I lived right on the equator, so there are tremendous needs, water needs, agricultural needs, educational needs, medical needs, stuff like that. And I was gung-ho driven to find solutions to all these problems. And one stage, an old man was sitting at a meeting outside. He puts his hand up and he says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I'm 26, I'm Irish, I know everything. Sure, fire. And he says to me, "Can you tell me why is it that for you Europeans, your only response to a problem is to want to solve it?" I'm thinking, dude, what do you do with a problem except solve it? So I said to him, "Well, what do you do when you have a problem?" And I never forget what he said to me. We're talking in Swahili. But what he said basically was, he said, "A problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do with the problem is solve it, life will just give you another problem. And if your response to that is to solve it, life will give you a third problem." And it became really, really important. And so I developed then a 5-stage model of problem solving for myself, just a few years ago now. And the first stage of a problem, I'm faced with a personal problem. The first thing I do is I say, I am a holographic fractal of source. Number 2, I volunteer to be here now. Number 3, I'm surrounded with all these kinds of blessings. I have a family, I've got resources, I've got intelligence, I've got a community like COJ, I've got personal friends, I got all these things. The fourth thing is, How can I harvest this present predicament to further my mission of awakening people to Christ consciousness? And then fifthly, and only then, what is my response now, practically speaking, to this present issue that precipitated that chain of thought? So for me, that's the way I do it. Yeah. Great question, Elizabeth. So how we to differentiate between the lies and the truth on the planet? There are so many perspectives. Here's another dream quote I got many years ago. There's a huge difference between truth and fact. Something can be true, but not factual, and something can be factual, but not true. So here's my definition of truth. Something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with source, and something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with source. So facts are just things that happen in the physical world, but they're not truth. They don't transform me. I don't know what the Dow Jones is today, whatever it is. Am I transformed by that figure? Absolutely not. I could care less. Truth can be, something could be not factual, but true. And I give you, my favorite example is the great story that you find in Luke's Gospel of the Good Samaritan. Jesus is being interrogated by the Pharisees, and the one Pharisee says to him, there are 613 precepts in Torah. Which of them is the most important? And Christ says the most important one is love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind. And I'll give you the second most important one, even though you didn't ask for it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the Pharisee says, yeah, but who's my neighbor? And then Christ, being Christ, decided to tell a story. He said, there was a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged, and he was left dying at the side of the road. And a priest from the temple was going down the same way, and he saw a fellow Jew lying at the side of the road, and he bypassed, because for a priest to touch a dead body would make him unclean, and he couldn't go into the temple. So he passed by and left the guy there. Some hours later, a Levite went down, and the Levites were the temple police. And he's under the same restrictions. If he touches a dying body, he's unclean and he can't go into the temple. So he passes by. A few hours later, a Samaritan goes by, and the Samaritans are deadly enemies of the Jews. And the Samaritan sees this Jew at the side of the road, really in straits. And he cauterizes his wounds. He pours wines into his wounds, puts him up on his own donkey, and takes him into Jericho, and he checks in at a hotel. And he says to the innkeeper, I have to go off in business for a few days. Can you look after this man? And I'll pick up the tab when I come back. Now, imagine you're a reporter for the Jerusalem Post, and you hear Jesus telling this story. And you say, right, likely story. I don't believe it. And you go to the temple and you knock at the door, and the high priest comes out, and you say, so and so and so and so. Is that a true story? Did this happen? Did one of you guys go down to Jericho last week and buy somebody leave at the side of the road? And the high priest goes in and says, guys, listen up. Anybody here go to Jericho in the last week? No. None of us went down there. And you go over to the Levites and you knock at the door, and the Levite comes out and you ask the same question. Did any of you guys go down to Jericho in the last week? Let me just check. No. And you go back to Jesus, you're the reporter, you say, that was a heap of lies. That never happened. And maybe it didn't. Was it true? Absolutely true. Because the people who heard that story were radically transformed by it. Radically transformed by it. So that's my definition of truth. How do we differentiate truth from lies? If you're transformed by it, if it causes you to act with love and compassion, it's true. If it's making you hate anybody and be prejudiced against anybody, it's not true. Maybe factual, but it's not true. So the question is about reincarnation. Catholics allegedly do not believe in reincarnation. So how do we deal with that one? The truth is that Jesus taught reincarnation, and the Catholic Church taught reincarnation until the Second Council of Constantinople in the year 553 AD. So let me give you the background to it. There are two great stories that you find in the New Testament. One of them is in Matthew chapter 17, where Jesus, the week before he dies, takes Peter and James and John up to the top of Mount Tabor. And he has a vision, a dream vision, in which he encounters Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses died 1250 years before Jesus, and Elijah died 850 years before Jesus, but now they are talking to Jesus. So for me, Jesus is actually visiting the Jewish section of the Akashic records. He's trying to check up on his own history, because he's only 1 week to live, and he knows what his mission is. Now, as they're coming down from the mountain, one of the disciples says to Jesus, why do the scriptures tell us that before the Messiah comes, Elijah has to come back? And Jesus says to him, Elijah has already come back. And they didn't recognize him. And then Matthew's gospel adds in parentheses, here Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. And so Jesus is saying John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah. There's another great story in John's gospel, I think maybe about chapter 8 or 9, of a man born blind. And so Jesus is coming out of the city of Jericho with the disciples, and there's a beggar, blind beggar sitting at the gate. This guy was born blind and he's begging that for a living. And the disciples look at this beggar, and according to Jewish kind of theology, every infirmity was the result of somebody's sin. God wouldn't kind of visit any infirmity on anybody who wasn't a sinner. So for the Jewish theology, the four great signs of God's blessing when you were Jewish, you were male, you were healthy, and you were wealthy. If you were Jewish and male and healthy and wealthy, God was blessing you. If you lacked any one of those, God is cursing you for some reason or other because of somebody's sin. So now obviously this guy was born blind, and they said to him, whose sin caused his blindness? Was it his parents' sin or his own sin? Now, if you didn't believe in reincarnation, how could somebody be born blind for their own sin? Because in Hebrew mythology, they believed in reincarnation. And the early Catholic Church believed in reincarnation and taught reincarnation until the Second Council of Constantinople in the year, I think it was 553 AD, when the then emperor outlawed it at a council. And the reason was that his wife, I'm blocking her name, I think it may have been Theodora, I'm not certain, was born into a kind of a lower class, and she married up and she became the empress, and she was damned if she was going to have to come back and do that again. She made it all the way to the top. So she convinced him to ban reincarnation, and that was it. Reincarnation was out. But obviously in esoteric Christianity and in many of the great esoteric spiritual systems, people understand and they know that nothing, even matter can't be destroyed. You can only change the state of matter. So you certainly can't destroy a soul or an incarnational experience.
Father Seán, I really love the problem as an invitation to self-transcendence.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful. And you talked about the 5 parts, and you said the 4th part was, how can I harvest this?
Yeah.
What was the 5th part? I missed that.
Solving the problem.
Solving the problem.
So I'm faced with a problem, but before trying to solve the problem, I'm going to say I'm a holographic fractal source.
Right.
I volunteer to be here now. I'm surrounded by all kinds of resources and benefits and blessings. I'm going to harvest the situation, for Christ consciousness. Now, with that in mind, how do I actually deal with the physical problem, the current issue?